I'm talking to Chris Collison, who is an author, a consultant, and an advisor in the area of organisational knowledge and learning. Chris, we're talking about lessons learned, and I suspect that different people will have lots of different views about what lessons learned actually means. Do you want to start with an explanation and a view of what can and should be captured in document form and what really won't work with lessons learned?
I guess I see lessons learned as more of an outcome than an input. It's easy to feel like you've done your lessons learned when the project team have had a bit of a debrief and shot the briefs together and identified a few lessons for themselves. And I guess I take like many people, a more holistic view, more of a looped view of learning. So if we were to sort of step through the key stages, I would say, around lessons learned and look at where kind of capture is important and where maybe just connections and conversations are equally important. So let's start with something's happened, some substantial project activity, a major project even, and you've reached a particular stage, maybe it's the very end or maybe it's a key milestone when there's a belief that it's a moment for reflecting, capturing something useful for the future. So first, I think one of the first questions to think about is, well, who is the customer for the conversation we're about to have as a project team, about to pause and reflect maybe for half a day or so. And the customer will clearly be the existing team. Everybody wants to improve their practice. But maybe more importantly is who is the next team, the next people who might make use of this. And I usually try and frame a good lessons learned review, project review meeting, whatever you want to call it, retrospect, many words for them, around the needs of the next customer rather than maybe a cathartic conversation for the current team. So do it quickly, do it before the project team is in danger of dispersing to the four winds, because they often do that. Have a customer in mind. And if you know of a customer, I'm saying in terms of customer for the knowledge and the learning, somebody in the next team, if you know them, then why not invite them to just be present? You don't have to say anything. But them listening in will be far more enriching than you giving them a document at the end of the day. Because obviously when we go from a room full of conversations and maybe even some disagreement or contention to the final written report or the bullet points on the PowerPoint slides, then we are losing huge amounts of insight. And I always say bullet points are called bullet points because they often kill knowledge. And I think it's true. So have them in the room if you know who they are. If you don't know who they are, but you sense there will be a future team, then some teams actually invent a fictitious person. They don't press gang somebody off the street, but they might put an empty chair at the table and give them a name badge. So this is Anna. And periodically through the review process, they might say, so what is our advice to Anna? What are we going to tell Anna in terms of the things that she should do or should avoid doing so that she can be sure to repeat our success or avoid the nightmare that we've just discussed together? And I think having that context of we're learning with a view that it will inform somebody else is a helpful reminder. So I tend to do that. If there's not a real customer, I'll invent one and have them figuratively in the room and refer to them. So get the right people together, do it quickly. And then it comes down to, I guess, a process of asking the right questions. So going deep enough so that you really can reveal the underlying reason. We've all seen lessons learned reports which cause the reader to call out in frustration. Yeah, but why? Why? What was the reason behind that? I try and ask some of those questions for the potential future reader and have that in mind. Have we really reached the root cause? And there are lots of techniques for that. They're the 5 whys. It's the most classic one where you literally do ask the why question, or you finesse it and make it less of an interrogation, perhaps, of the person who you're exploring. So I find it useful to access kind of emotional highs and lows for individuals. So I usually say, once we've established context and kind of what the review is about, and encourage individuals to think about the high spots and the low spots and the turning points, the all-nighters, the difficult meetings, and think about what went particularly well, and then subsequently what were the real disappointments in the process. And then when they've all had a chance to think about maybe 3 or 4 things that went really well, then individually giving them time to explore that and using those 5 whys or some similar questioning technique to just ensure that they're not stopping short of the root cause. And then the sort of the questions that turn it from an interesting kind of cathartic learning conversation to something of use to the next team is when you tip it into, so what is your advice? So what are the recommendations we would make to the next team, to Anna in some cases? So I never leave it at what do you think you've learned, because that's okay, but that's a little introspective. The real question is, what should somebody else do or not do? So I always push it to, what's your advice? So lots of ways of doing that. One is to say, What's your advice to the next team? Or maybe make it a little bit more imaginable. Imagine you're just sitting down for lunch with somebody and you hear them talking about the next project they're about to do and realize there's some common ground with the one you've just done. What would you say to them? Or if you could go back in time and shout something in your ear, what would be the kind of the key words of advice you wish you'd given yourself if you could have been Marty McFly? So finding creative ways to try and crystallize out the advice from the conversation. So then I would do that. Everyone gets their chance to do that, goods and bads. And then usually, and you may want to step through the timeline of the project or particular processes, whatever makes most sense in terms of breaking it down into manageable chunks. And then there's a nice sort of sweeper exercise at the end where you might say, how many marks out of 10 would we give this particular project or activity? Typically, Brits never give more than about 7 or 8 because we're like that. So the what would make it a 10 question is always good. And actually, sometimes it's helpful to separate product and process. So because we all know we can deliver a good output, but actually the way we got there can be pretty grim. So if you say, well, what are you, marks out of 10 for the outcome, if you like, output? What about marks out of 10 for the process, how we got there? Actually, 4 out of 10, because there were all-nighters, there were arguments, there was a breakdown with the contractor. Let's talk about that then. So it's good to separate those two things out. So that's got as far as the questions part. And then I guess the question is, what do you do with that? How do you capture something meaningful out of that? Now, I guess just stepping back a little bit, if people are willing, and only obviously if they're willing, it's really helpful to have a recording of the conversation, just like we're doing right now. Makes it a whole lot easier for whoever's supposed to be there facilitating and or taking notes. So if you can get agreement to do that and you believe it will not prejudice the conversation, then just have an audio recording. Video recording is probably pushing the limits a bit. However, during breaks of reviews, during the coffee breaks and things, if somebody said something, maybe a little story, an anecdote, a nice little soundbite that's quite apposite, then I might say to them, would you mind just repeating that? Maybe saying it to my iPhone camera, just so I have got maybe potentially a mini talking head that I can drop in just a minute or two to whatever the final product might be. So transcripts are valuable. If you can't get a transcript, then listen out for sound bites, for notable things that you know you can use at a later stage to draw in the reader, because I do believe in designing the output with a view that somebody needs to be engaged in it rather than if they're really hungry, they'll go fish for it. So I am more in the frame of what would a really interesting magazine article look like. So I would typically start with a photograph of the people who are in the room. I think it's really important to anchor lessons learned with the people they came from. So first step, again, if they're willing, you can black them out and give them anonymous identities if they really want that. But on the whole, it's nice to have a photograph of the team with their contact details. And then underneath that, I'm thinking this is a Word document or something similar, or a PowerPoint deck, the next slide would be, for me, a list of the high-level recommendations. These are the top 10, top 15 things that we recommend a similar team or project should consider first. Start here. These are our high-level things. And then for each of those, I would typically hyperlink that through into somewhere else in the body of the document, which would be more like the narrative, the story, the lesson, if you like, that was learned, and some of the why questions around that. So give the causal track back to where it came from. Start with a recommendation so that the reader can choose which recommendation they're going to click through to. Almost designing an e-learning resource rather than a report, if that makes sense. So then in addition to the narrative, the lessons, a bit about the underlying reasons, there may be some artifacts, there may be some reference documents, a role description, a change plan, a budget, whatever you think might be useful for the next team. I usually say to teams, I bet there are some really good examples, templates and documents that you would have put onto a memory stick at the end of the project to take with you to the next one. How about we have a bit of an amnesty and we bring those out and embed them in the report we're about to write, because they probably will be useful artifacts for the next team. So that can be valuable. So wrapping all that up in a nice graphical, interesting, visually appealing document, drawing out quotes and sound bites, embedding little video clips if necessary, linking to documents. For me, that feels a bit more engaging than most of the kind of lessons learned project review reports that I've had the misfortune of reading. So that's a bit about capturing. So we've got our report. What do we do with it? Well, we can email it around, or we can bury it somewhere in SharePoint or our favorite repository. And I usually make the point that sharing something is not the same as not hiding it. Now, what I mean by that is there's often a moment of virtue when we think, right, we've done our review, we've written that really nicely with a customer in mind. Now let's put it somewhere and then our job is done. And I always say, no. Who are the people who would value you using this? Let's be proactive. Let's put it somewhere and send them a link to it. Remind them. Go and talk to them. Go and engage their management meeting. Go and do a brown bag lunch and talk through the lessons you've done and reference people with your docket. So I think you need more of a proactive edge to take people through that. Otherwise, it'll just be another possible report that one day I might get around to. And then at that point, we've done as much as we can do really on the supply side of lessons learned, or almost as much. I'll come back around to a secondary learning loop in a moment. So then the question is, how do we inspire curiosity on the side of the next team, the team who we are hoping will be diligent enough and committed enough and have enough headroom to do their review of existing documents, to find this, to look through it, to draw out their lessons, to combat all the not invented here syndrome antibodies that might be flying out to try and reject anything you've written because your project was a bit different, and actually identify something they can adapt and change in their projects. And you can sense, as I'm saying that, all the way through, there are ways in which knowledge and learning and value falls away because of all of those reasons. So, but nonetheless, there's value in capturing, storing, and encouraging the demand side. Now, we might encourage that through leadership expectations. I was sitting with Diffage yesterday, and they have just produced a little kind of business card, reminder card for their leaders, which include a number of questions that they would love their senior leaders, senior responsible officers and owners to drip feed and to ask of members of their team. Questions like, who have you shared this with? Or who else might have a similar challenge who you could maybe talk to? Those sorts of questions that point them to interactions rather than anything else. So there may be some things you can do to reinforce that through leadership behavior, a little bit of role modeling. You can reinforce it through process by requiring that future projects demonstrate that they've done some due diligence learning before doing, that they've looked through what's available, or maybe that they've had more people-focused meeting like a peer assist in order to draw knowledge through. So you need, I think, to stimulate the demand side for lessons learned just as much as you do with the supply side. And then you are genuinely in the getting closer to having a learning cycle where somebody else is learning what the original team learned. I guess just one final thing to say, and then I'll pause for breath and let you come to the next question. I do believe there are three forms of customer for lessons learned. The first customer we've mentioned is the team who are doing the learning. They want to improve professionally. They want to make sure they build on strengths and so on. So they are the primary customer, and that's probably the one you're going to appeal to first of all. Second customer is the next team, a future team, some future group who will be making use of some aspect of, some facet of the learning you've got, and we'll structure it in a way that makes that facet easy to catch the light. And the tertiary customer, the third customer, maybe the most powerful customer in some respects, is the organization itself. There may be a lesson learned which actually, rather than the next team making sure they don't do it or they do it, there's an opportunity to embed that learning in a change to the organization. So maybe there is a standard operating procedure, a process, a way of working, a clause in a contract that we can change such that rather than going and looking through all these lessons and, we keep making that mistake, we should make sure we don't do it. In a way, the necessity to do that goes away because we've actually changed something in the organization. There's an argument, and I would give it some support, that actually the very best lesson learned system in the world are empty because the lessons have all been commuted into some kind of organizational change or action. And then we can dispense with the lessons because they're just a transitionary particle in a reaction that has gone through to conclusion. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind. And that action of who's going to address the potential organizational change is the one that's most likely to fall through the cracks. Because we all feel virtuous, we've done our thing, we've even told the next team, but oh, blimey, going and talking to the official governance board for the X process, that just feels like a bit of a bridge too far. I'll put it on my to-do list and probably never get there. So, but I do think in a way that's the most valuable action a team could take.
As you were particularly describing the way that you approach the actual lessons learned meeting, I was thinking of a technique that I learned from Eddie Obeng. His 5 eyes, and one of his eyes is the movie eye. So taking a kind of movie director's view of what's going on in the meeting and looking for opportunities, as you say, just to capture a snippet on audio or a snippet on video and thinking about how you're going to direct this for the benefit of the people who are you're asking to use it or consume it subsequently. So that was really interesting.
There's something similar which I do, which I wasn't aware of Eddie's movie. I like that. I do an exercise that kind of inverts the responsibility for learning. So if you had a project or a representative of a project that had done something of substance, good or bad, it's then getting a group of their peers, people who want to learn from them, sitting down at the table, and you kind of you frame it as there's somebody here with a story and the rest of you are newspaper reporters, and you have 45 minutes to interview this person, and you're going to create a one-page flip chart which is going to include a headline, a photograph or a stickman picture of the person, some pithy quotes, summary of the narrative, some kind of recommendations, lessons learned, whatever recommendations for the next group, and some kind of contact details. And just shifting the burden from the person who's been involved in activity to the, if you like, the group around them. It's up to them to draw the learning out. It's a demand-led process rather than supply-led, I wonder what I can share process, is a really interesting shift to see in groups. And you get in my view, you often get a much better product. And sometimes the person who did the activity is really surprised at where the conversation goes, but they have to play the role of being interviewed rather than constructing the story from their own perspective. So that's probably a variant on Eddie's movie eye.
We've talked about lessons learned as a fairly linear process, a process that's happening through time, certainly. And I wonder whether there's a role for the PMO or the change management team if the organisation is endeavouring to change, to improve as an organisation and has a programme to do that. Then I'm wondering whether they should be influencing somehow the lessons learned activity, because they have a specific output that they're trying to achieve, a specific set of behaviours that they're moving towards.
I think you're absolutely right. And I would say there's probably two primary roles for those kind of central groups. One is as a role of connector. So again, a number of organisations will have maybe a step in their kind of project life cycle right at the very beginning that would say, kind of, who can you learn from? And I'm not just talking about what's been written that you can dredge up, but more if you could get 10 people in a room for half a day to share their experience with you, who would those ideal people be? Sounds like the dinner party question, doesn't it? Who would you like to have a dinner party with? So then we in BP, where I started my career, we call these things peer assists. So a peer assist, getting assistance from your peers because you've made a request for help. And a PMO or a change team are very good at helping point to the people who might have that project experience because they've got that overview. Now, there are other ways of getting to those people as well. Who's who directories, and just finding someone who's been around the block a long time and knows where the bodies are buried. But often PMOs know where the bodies are buried, so they may be a good proxy for that. So there's a connecting role, and there's probably also a curating or collecting role as well, because I would imagine that a good PMO will begin to spot and would be able to identify strategic themes that occur through the projects they're doing. They know what the future pipeline of programs and projects looks like. They know the kind of capabilities or issues might be for the future. So when they are aware that a completed project has just happened upon one of those kind of issues, they can almost zoom in and encourage maybe a deeper dive, or even begin to collate and curate that part of a lessons learned report, an output around those themes. So rather than having a chronological pile of reports from projects going back through the years, what you actually have is a set of kind of thematic cuts through the kind of projects that we do. Nice example of that is the Olympic Games. Olympic Games do a big review, as you'd imagine. In fact, they do their review in the presence of the next host city. So London's Lesson Learned review from 2012 was done in Rio, because Rio were the main next customer. So they did it there. And there will be a report written with a London story, but also alongside that, the key learnings will be divided up thematically. So there will be, for the IOC who manage the process, they have what they call their reference materials, which cover about 30 different topics, things they know will be processes or capabilities, issues that every future games will need to host. So examples being opening ceremonies, ticketing, transport, security, safety, information and knowledge management, and advertising, those kind of things. You get the idea, the torch relay. So because they know there will always be a call for that kind of knowledge, they will deliberately create, if you like, a distillation of what have we learned from the last 8 editions of the Olympic Games about ticketing processes or cybersecurity. So there's a living, refreshed document, as well as the chronological, tell me the London story. I need to look at the whole thing in its entirety. And that thematic view is both establishing the themes and then managing the knowledge around those themes, could fall to a PMO. And it may even be that the PMO wants to be the sponsor of a number of little networks or communities of practice around some of those emergent topics. But yeah, I agree with you, definitely.
Chris, thank you so much. I've got a really rich set of ideas and techniques there which we can use. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.